Welcome back to the Ultimate Homeschool Community Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Hernandez. Today we have Becky with us, and she is here to share all about nonprofits. She is going to be the go-to person if you are trying to start a nonprofit for a co-op, for a micro school, for any kind of educational service. And she is here with us to share all about the ins and outs. So you're not going to want to miss this episode. And we will have her on again for our ESA funds and our series that has to do with that. So you're going to want to check that out after this one. So welcome, Becky. Can you share with us a little bit about how you got into this and about Ed Solutions? Because we know we need it. Nobody wants to deal with paperwork, but it has to happen.
Yes, of course. Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and share about some things I'm really passionate about, which is kind of dorky because there is, like you said, a lot of paperwork and but I really do for some odd reason I actually enjoy those things. And maybe it's because it does make a difference to founders and people trying to navigate these things who really need to be freed up to focus on the programs.
Yes.
So I love that the work that I do makes a difference too. But I'd love to share. I was a founder about 10 years ago, almost 11 now. I had started homeschooling and had lots of kids. I have 5 kids and they were really spaced out. I had a baby and then my oldest was like 12 or 13 at the time. So I started homeschooling and formed a co-op, just trying to find some connection. And then that was very popular. There was not a lot at the time for people in our community, so it like grew, which I think you've experienced with your group too. So it was great. We ended up doing like a 1 day co-op for a handful of years, and that is still operational right now. And then in 2019, we expanded to add a 2 day hybrid program, and then added a second campus about 30 minutes away, in 2019. So no, 2021, because it was a couple years later. So anyways, I did all of that. In about 2021, I got involved with Carol Top of the Homeschool CPA. And she was looking to retire and wanted to mentor at least one or more people to kind of carry the torch for her. And her vision was this nonprofit assistance and consulting work. And so I had used a lot of her materials to form and run the nonprofit that I ran, and was excited about seeing her work continue. And so was mentored by her for about a year and a half. And then I am excited and continue to carry the torch for her. So yeah, my work at Nonprofit Ed Solutions is the bulk of it is helping people file the nonprofit incorporation paperwork and write good bylaws, teach them what it means to run a nonprofit. So what does it mean to be on a nonprofit board, and what do board members do, and what do you do at a board meeting, and do you have to vote, and all those wonky things that are people are like, is that I like have to or can, because I'm not sure. And then that 501c3 application that can be very intimidating, is kind of the capstone of the project that I work through with founders, helping them file that. But I do also do consulting, and sometimes people are just like, this is a mess and I inherited a mess or something like that, and can we just talk? And so I have consulting blocks on my calendar for that as well. So okay, that's a little summary about myself and my work.
Yes. Yes. Very, very, very successful in how you got your group going, and it's still going, even though, you've moved past the torch for your own group because it's now, you have this hybrid program and it's this whole setup and it's still running, right? So that's really that like shows proof in the pudding. And so with that, I know you mentioned about nonprofit and 501c3. What exactly is a nonprofit? And is that the same as a 501c3? We know there's several different listings of filings. Can you share a little bit about what that even means?
Yeah, that's a really good question and comes up a lot. A nonprofit is a corporation, so it has similar protection to like an LLC, where it is a separate entity than if you had like a sole proprietorship. A nonprofit, so it is a corporation, formed in your state, and that's where people sometimes get hung up on like, oh, I formed a nonprofit, so now I have a 501c3, and those words can get used interchangeably. So it's important to know that like, well, you form a nonprofit in your state, You need to have a board in place to do that and have bylaws. That's all a part of like running and operating a nonprofit, but you're not tax exempt and you're not a 501c3 until you go to the IRS, to the federal government, and request to be a 501c3. And I have worked with groups who are, had done the nonprofit incorporation and were doing all the right things and had really good bylaws and thought that they like had checked all their boxes, and then come to me years later and like, someone told us that like we missed a step. Like, yeah, that 501c3 step is really important. So some people know that, but not everybody knows it, and I really like to make it really clear that those are two separate things. Being a 501c3, but a nonprofit 501c3 is formed for charitable purposes. So often when someone starts a business, it's the end goal is to make money, to be successful, to have your business make money and thrive. So it's a little bit different with a nonprofit. The end goal is to make a difference. And you might make money, but the money that you make after you're paying your basic expenses of the organization, the money that you make is spent to make a difference. So it's called public benefit or social benefit. Instead of private benefit is the difference with a nonprofit. So there are lots of types of 501c3s, a lot of purposes that would qualify for those. The one that is often most applicable to our situation is educational. So educational purpose does qualify for tax exemption and is considered a charitable purpose or for public benefit. But there are a lot of other ones, religious, literary, scientific research. There's a whole list. I think it's 29, but in our case, educational is what qualifies us.
Right, right. Okay, so I'm glad we talked about that because yes, you do need to register with your state, and then you also still need to register with the federal government, which is what you help with. And getting all those
Mhm.
bylaws correct. We're going to talk about that a little bit later because we really want to make sure that those are right. We've had several founders at least come to me about how that has messed them up later down the road.
Mhm.
So we're going to get to that.
Yeah,
Can we talk about why
yeah.
an educational program might want to have a nonprofit instead of like a LLC or an S corp? Um, we know that we've talked in the past as well about how they could potentially work in conjunction with each other because there are several programs out there right now that are currently running both, just so that way they have the
Mhm.
ownership of the LLC. Can you explain too, in that how you are a steward of the nonprofit, you don't technically own the nonprofit.
Right. Yes, you're right. Nobody owns a nonprofit. And sometimes people are like, well, that's enough for me not to want to start one. Like, well, hold on, we can talk about it. But yeah, the nonprofit is managed by a board of directors and they have a fiduciary duty, which means that they are trustees of the organization and of the assets and the programs of the nonprofit, but nobody owns it. So there's a big can of worms because as a founder myself, like I can understand the concern of I've invested a lot of time. I did, like I invested a ton of time and my own finances and resources and energy and like 10 years of my life and my health and all of these things into making this program successful. So I can understand when people are hesitant of like, well, I don't own it and it's not going to be something that I can pass on to as a legacy. So all valid questions. Um, there are some things that can be done. They're called founders provisions that can be put in the bylaws, but you have to be really careful with those. The IRS doesn't like that. And so the board does need to be an active participant, but that's a technical thing. Seek help if you want to put something like that in your bylaws to try to honor the position, the hard work of the founder. Um, so yes, nobody owns it. What was the other question you asked, Tiffany,
About
about?
for profit, like why would you want to do non for
Yes,
profit
yes,
versus for
nonprofit versus.
profit or an S corp?
Okay. Yeah. Well, so there's like the obvious reason if you do both steps and you go all the way to becoming a 501c3, then your organization is tax exempt. And so all the revenues that are coming in, you're not going to need to pay federal taxes to the IRS. And usually you'll be exempt from state taxes as well. There might be an additional application you do in your state to get that. But it will usually make you tax exempt from the IRS, tax exempt from your state. there are situations in some states where you can be exempt from sales tax. A lot of states and counties exempt from property tax. So there's all these like tax exemption potentials. The big one is that 501c3 IRS tax exemption. But then there are other things to consider too. As a nonprofit, technically for-profits are not allowed to use volunteer labor. And so a lot of these educational programs, volunteerism is really built into the structure. I know it was for us. They made a big difference in helping us run the day-to-day aspects of the program. So being able to legally use volunteers and not worry about like, oh, am I doing something wrong, would be a really good reason to form a nonprofit. Grant funding, and it's not always the case. You could receive a grant as like an LLC or an S corp. There's nothing that says that you can't, but most grant funders will want you to be a 501c3 in order to receive grant funding. So grant funding is a big reason. I think those are the main ones. Property tax. Sometimes you can run into like, if you're an LLC and then you're using a building that is a nonprofit's building, so maybe a church or even like a library or a public park, those are all things that are formed for public benefit, and you are a for-profit business, there's the potential that it could jeopardize the property tax exemption of the facility that you're using. And it's not a huge, like, we don't see it happening a ton, but it is happening, where the city or the county assessor is figuring out what's going on and then either assessing fines or completely nullifying the property tax exemption for those buildings. So all around, that nonprofit 501c3 is going to be the better option in most of these situations. But then you asked about, can you have both? Can you run both? How can they work together? So I mean, for a while there, it was like, no, I would just be like, no, you can't, you don't want to do that. But you're right. Like, there are a lot of people that are doing it. And so I think it's important to speak to like, well, how can we do it correctly? How can we do that well? So I just spoke yesterday with a founder, and so it's kind of fresh on my mind, and I'm happy to kind of share what we talked about, because she has built this micro school and wants it to be her legacy. The name of the micro school is very much associated with her, and she's fairly well known. So it's hard for her, the thought of having to like close her LLC in order to because you can't often convert, like you got to get a new AIN. You usually dissolve that LLC, start a new nonprofit. So for her, initially, like we had talked a few weeks ago, and she was like, no, I know that that's what I need to do. And so I'm just going to do it. And then I talked to her yesterday and she's like, I can't do it. And I thought, that's fine. I totally understand. So we got on Canva because we were on Zoom and kind of sketched out like, how could this work? So she has this LLC over here, and that's running her micro school program. But then she has a heart to like provide scholarships and funding and support and resources for micro school founders, and micro school families, students who want to attend these micro school hybrid type programs. So we're going to open this nonprofit, and then she's going to put some of her work and effort into that. So the trick is where the money is flowing. So we kind of had some arrows that went between the two. So she has this LLC. Her LLC was actually able to receive a good sized grant. So her LLC has some funding, and she can give money from her LLC to her nonprofit, no problem. And that's a tax deduction for her LLC because she'll be donating to a 501c3, like all good. So her LLC can support her nonprofit and all of those mission driven purposes that her nonprofit is going to provide. And then her nonprofit will be eligible for grant funding. So if she's going to provide financial aid or scholarships for students, then hopefully she'll be able to more easily gain additional funding for that through her nonprofit. The problem is if the nonprofit generates funding either through grant money or provides some type of programs and services and it's bringing in revenues, if the nonprofit is giving money to her LLC, and it's not at arm's length and it's just kind of being funneled back and forth because she's involved with both, then that's where you get in trouble. Because the LLC does not have that 501c3 status that was, the IRS was very very much scrutinizing your organization for. So if the nonprofit's like, hey, I'm just going to give this money to my LLC now, it's like, no, that's not what you told us you were going to do. Um, so it's one thing for like if her LLC were to provide services that her nonprofit were to pay for, if her LLC provides teacher training and then her nonprofit wants to provide scholarships for families to participate in her teacher training, then perhaps that could work. But even then, like you have to be careful if that was all you were doing was your LLC is providing all of these services and then your nonprofit is providing all the money for everyone to participate in your services and it's very tight knit and there aren't other organizations involved and that's kind of the main focus, then that looks very much like self-dealing. So in her case, I suggested if because she's wanting to help expand and start additional micro schools. And I said, so if your nonprofit is providing financial aid and scholarships for families who are attending multiple programs, and it's not just limited to your program run by your LLC, then that looks very much more like it's a generalized thing that you're doing and not that it's just funding for your LLC. Does that make sense?
Yes, it's for the public. It's not just for personal gain on your private LLC.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it can be done. It can be a little bit messy if it's not run very cleanly and like all of
Right,
those transactions should be really well documented and
right.
it should be a limited
Bookkeeping.
part of what your nonprofit does. Yeah, it shouldn't
Right.
be the main focus of what your nonprofit does.
Isn't there like a percentage that we want to stay within of like how much is given, let's say even in scholarships and things to the LLC or to the educational service from the nonprofit?
The to my understanding, the IRS rarely gives an actual percentage.
Okay.
So a lot of times those percentages are derived from case studies where, maybe there was a situation where an organization got in trouble and the
Okay.
IRS said that it was okay because it was less than such and such percent. So a lot of times people will study what's happened
Okay.
in the past and kind of come up with these like maybe it's around 20%, maybe it's around 10%.
Okay.
So maybe you've heard of a
Yes.
case study that I'm not aware of. But yeah, as far like there's a lot of times where the IRS will be like reasonable participation or arm's length decisions, and there's not like the super defined definition.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
so to me, it would look like a minimal amount of money flowing to the LLC for either goods or services or scholarships or something. I'd if I had to throw out a percentage, like 10%,
Maybe.
15%, I'm not sure.
Right.
I'd have
Okay.
to look into that further too, but yeah.
Right. Okay. No, that makes sense. And I'm glad we could probably do a whole like how do we actually make this clean? Because that is another thing is like making sure bookkeeping is really clean on both sides and the flow of money is making sense and your
Mhm.
board is approving this flow and they're in like it's not just the
Right.
founder that's in charge of both doing only all of the transactions or whatever or like awarding all of the scholarships,
Right.
right? Like that's a board decision, so you also got to make sure on the 501c3 side that everything is very well documented because whenever audits come by or whatever have you, you have your CY. Okay, so speaking about
Right.
all of the paperwork,
It can get
uh,
messy.
exactly. What
Yes.
would you say are the basic steps in forming that 501c3? Because we know there's a state side, we know there's a federal side. What are kind of like the basic things that an educational service would need to have in order to get that registered?
Yeah. Okay. So basic steps. So there may be some, this is a little bit of a generalization, but we've talked quite a bit about a board. So if you're going to run a nonprofit, like we've mentioned a few times now, you need to have a board. The IRS prefers, well, actually not prefers. They will not approve your 501c3 if you don't have at least three unconflicted board members listed on your
Right.
application.
Meaning
So you
not
got to have
all
that
from
three.
family.
Some like there are right, right. Yes. So like your state might say that it's fine just to have one board member or two board members or two officers. There's different variations per state, but the IRS is like, no, you're gonna have three. And you're right, they can't all just be family. That would be called a private foundation, and that's really different. Those don't usually operate programs, and they need to be unconflicted. So you got to think of like what are things that cause conflict of interest. So relation, by either blood, marriage, or business. So you may have a friend and you guys run a business together, like running
Like a
a
bake
cooking
shop.
program for
Yeah.
students. And yeah, yeah. And you guys run that little business together, but it's very much you are partners in that business. So business relationship is considered a conflict of interest. So those two could not be on the board together unless the board was bigger. We can talk about that. But and then like if a board member is being paid to help run the programs of the organization, that is considered a conflict of interest because the board is the one that oversees the organization and then you work for the organization, so it's kind of like you're doing both. So you want to limit conflicts of interest. And I love Carol, my mentor would be like, no, no conflicts of interest. And I lean more that way of ideally, you just don't have them on your board. If someone has a conflict of interest, it's ideal for them not to be on the board. Or perhaps they're on the board in an advisory role, but they don't actually have a vote. That would be much better than them having a vote. But if someone was paid by the organization, they can't vote on their pay. Like they just can't. There's no gray area there. Like they have to get up and leave the room and let the board decide what they're going to get paid. So, so if you
Yeah.
think about it, like, well, I have a board of three members. These two are paid, so they have to step out of the room and it leaves the one sole member to make those decisions. You need the three to make those decisions. So if you have a little bit of those conflicts of interest, your board needs to be bigger. You might need to have five, or you might need to have seven board members so that those one or two that have a conflict of interest can leave the room and you still have a good, robust board to make those decisions. So that's the first one. You need to get a board established. Sometimes people, I'm a big fan of getting these things in place like right out the gate, so that you
Yes.
have your 501c3 status right away. You can apply for grants. You're not worried about should I be paying taxes during this time? Like you just get it done right away. Well, what happens is people are like, well, I'm going to be paid, or the two other people on the board with me are going to be paid. Um, and so I'm stuck because I can't move forward without them. And so my question always is, well, are you being paid right now? Like, well, no, we don't run anything. We have no money. I'm like, well, then you're not being paid yet. You can be on the board.
So,
So
right. In
often the
transition
board will
later.
start.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And then you'll transition it later to people who are ideally unpaid. And you can move some of those people that will be paid off the board because the board is not stagnant, doesn't have to stay the same. It can change. So that's a little bit about forming a board is going to be one of your first steps, often the first step. And then go ahead.
Can we talk about
Yeah.
family real quick? So let's say you don't have anybody
Yeah.
because you're new in an area or whatever. You absolutely can have family members starting out, but they need to be moved off the board within the first 3 years. Like that is a
Okay.
thing.
Yeah.
Um, I
Yeah.
have also had some friends that have had me, myself, and I on the board, and they've been passed with that until they could get others on the board. So don't let that be a deterrent for you to be like, well, I can't go this route because I absolutely don't have anybody. You can still get
Yeah.
started and then just be very proactive about making that change immediately.
Right. And I think that's probably why I'm like, just don't do it because you
I know.
have to change
I
it.
know.
You really don't want to get stuck in that like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot that I'm the only one listed on my board and
Yeah.
then get in trouble. So yeah,
Hmm.
there's definitely some gray like leeway that happens and maybe some grace that happens there, but it's really important that you follow through with those
Yes.
things and making those changes later on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Awesome.
Okay.
Shall we move on? The next
Yes.
step.
Next piece. Hmm.
Okay, so the next step would be forming bylaws. And the bylaws are similar to like the Constitution of the United States. The board, forming the board and doing the incorporation in your state would be like when we formed the US, we had the Declaration of Independence, and we, that was our statement. That was the birth of our country. But then over time, we developed the Constitution, and that's what the bylaws are. How are we going to operate? So the bylaws are a kind of high 30,000 feet view governing any day-to-day programming, things like that. Those are all going to be in program handbooks and policy manuals and things like that. The
Mm,
bylaws are really just going to address how the board operates and really high-level organizational operations.
right.
So it'll talk about what type of officers are you going to have, which you want to make sure that's in compliance with what your state says. So what officers will we have? How often will we have board meetings? How some of the nitty gritty things of like how much notice do we need for board meetings? Can people vote by email, and can we have a meeting over Zoom? Again, that would need to comply with your state law as well. Um, some other things, indemnification and things like that. So I have a bylaw template that I provide to my clients, and it's actually on my website for a free download. If anybody would like to take a look at it or possibly use
Yes.
it, they definitely can on my website. But forming those bylaws are important, and it is required. It is a legal document that's required to operate a 501c3 nonprofit.
Right.
So that's one step. Okay.
And we know the
Um,
bylaws can sometimes trip people up with, like you said, with the founders, and because they don't actually own it, they don't want to be voted off the board and all of that, which we'll get
mhm.
to. But just want to make sure we
Yes.
put a note in there to pin it for later.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So you put the bylaws in. Bylaws can be changed, and we'll probably talk about that later on as well. But sometimes people are like, what if I do it wrong? What if we miss a step? They will overthink it. So the bylaws can be changed by a vote of the board. So don't overthink it too much.
Yes. Yes.
Bylaws, the next step would be incorporation, and incorporation can sometimes these kind of are all being done at the same time. It would be really nice if you had your unconflicted board and your really nice bylaws, and then you incorporated. Like, that would be ideal if I was going to tell you what was ideal. But like I said, sometimes they're kind of all coming together at the same time. So you incorporate as a nonprofit in your state through the Secretary of State. Most states, if not all, I'd have to double check. I want to say all states at this point have an online application where you can fill it out online. Although the last one I did in Florida was about a year and a half now. And the thing with incorporation is if you're going to apply to be a 501c3, you have to have this bulky IRS required wording in your incorporation document. And it talks about dissolution and private benefit, no private benefit. It talks about like purpose, 501c3 purposes. So it's 3 paragraphs. You have to have that in your incorporation documents in order to be a 501c3. Some groups will get approved as a 501c3 without it, because if they use the easy form, the IRS is not looking at every single articles of incorporation. Whether they should be or not is, remains to be seen. But really you need to have these in your incorporation documents. Some states, like I'm in Oregon, and there are plenty of other states that will be kind and tell you need to have this wording if you're going to go on and become a 501c3, and like check this box if you want us to add it for you. And you're like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. How kind, like that you would help me with that. Because the state doesn't have to help you with that. Those are very separate, state and federal. They don't always work together. So then there are some states that will like tip you off, and it will say you might need to include some special wording if you're going to be a 501c3, but like they don't tell you what it is or offer to put it in for you, but at least they tip you off. And then there are other states. I've got a lot of clients happening in Kansas right now, because I'm working with Delina in Kansas, and so we've got some momentum there. So a lot of my clients in Kansas have already filed the articles of incorporation, and they don't have the wording because the Kansas
They're not nice.
articles, like no there's like no indication that you might be missing a step. There's like a section where you can upload an attachment, but it doesn't tell you why. It just says, would you like to upload an attachment? And the founders are like, I don't think so, and just hit submit. So then we're going back. It's not the end of the world. We're going back and we're amending to add the wording. It just takes additional time.
Because you're
The state
amending.
of Florida,
Right.
yes. So the state of Florida, you cannot add the required IRS wording online. You have to mail in your application with the IRS wording. There's nowhere to put it in their online application. And the more I dug into it, the more it was like, oh no, yeah, they say if you want to be a 501c3, you're gonna have to mail in your application. So
Wow.
it, it's kind of a pain. It looks different in every state, but make sure you're paying attention because it's just a pain to go back and amend it, and it costs
Yeah.
a little bit more money and can slow you down. So
Yes.
that's my main thoughts on that incorporation aspect.
Perfect.
Once you're incorporated, then that's when you would get the EIN. And that's one step that I would say, like, don't do those out of order. If you
Yeah.
file your incorporation paperwork and then for some reason it comes back and they're like, you can't have that name for whatever reason. Sometimes people will put co-op, because they're running a homeschool co-op. And so they'll put Arrows Christian Co-op or something like that with the word co-op. And then they'll think, cool, I filed my incorporation documents and now I'm going to go get an EIN, and they'll do it all in the same day. And they'll get an EIN with Arrows Christian Co-op on it. And then like a week later, get an email from the Secretary of State that is like, you can't use the word co-op in your name, which is the case in the state. Most states will say you cannot use the word co-op because there's a legal definition of a cooperative where all
Hmm.
of the profits are distributed to the members
To
of
the
the cooperative, often the employees
because
and the
it's
members.
right.
So
It's a
that's
different
not what a
type.
homeschool co-op is at all.
No, different
Right.
type of co-op. These are
Those
like
are,
farm to table
yep,
co-ops, community co-ops, co-ops where
yes.
your farm share, that kind of thing. Yes.
Right. Yes. So if anyone out there listening is wanting to start an organization and call it a homeschool co-op in your formal legal name, don't do it. Use something else, and then you can call it a co-op informally is fine, but on your legal
Right.
name. So trying to change the name on an EIN is a pain, and it could take months because you have to like send a letter to the IRS, hope they got it, hope they read it, wait for them to acknowledge it and make that change. So I normally you would just close that EIN and get a new one with your new name. But again, like it slows you down. So
Yeah.
ideally, you wait to make sure your incorporation documents are accepted and like stamped with the little date stamp of approval by your state, and then get an EIN. Please make sure that the name on your incorporation matches the name on your EIN exactly. Those need to match. So there are some variations because the IRS doesn't allow periods. It doesn't allow I have one group I'm working with right now that has the plus sign, like wild and free with a plus sign. You can't use the plus sign in the EIN application. So I haven't spoken to her about that yet, but I'm going to advise her that we use the word and that we spell out the word and in both her incorporation and her EIN, and then she can use the plus sign in her logo and in her informal paperwork is fine. But just be careful about special characters because we want the incorporation and the EIN to match as
Match.
much as possible. Those need to match. So then the last step, once you've gotten all those things in place, is the 501c3 application. And that is through the IRS. It's on a website called pay.gov. You create an account, you can do the whole application is only accepted online. You can't mail it in. There are two types of the 501c3. It's called the 1023. So there's the 1023 easy and the 1023 full form, the long form. The 1023 easy, if you have revenues that are under $50,000, and it's a cumulative projection of your first 3 years. So 150,000 over the course of your first 3 years. If you're projecting less than that, you could use the easy form. You would also need to have less than $250,000 in assets. So usually, if you're under 50,000 revenues, you don't have these major assets. But if you're going to be a school, even if you are projecting small revenues, but you're going to be a school, you need to use the long form. Um,
Can you explain
there's
school?
some, yeah, if you're going to be a school in the definition of like your state, that's what a school is. So a lot of these micro schools their families are registering as homeschoolers and they're not tracking their grades, they're not tracking they don't issue report cards and things like that. Those aren't really schools. Those are homeschool programs, and people are like, what do we call it? Well, you could call it a glorified tutoring center. You could call it an educational
Enrichment.
resource center. You could yeah. Yeah. And maybe be careful about using the word school in your formal and legal names. If you don't want to be considered a school in your state's definition, which means you're tracking attendance for compulsory attendance and potentially reporting attendance and enrollment to the state. It varies by state, but you will need to track attendance. You may need to report it. And then
Right.
vaccination records, immunizations is something that you would need to be tracking and recording as well. And then some states have different health and wellness policies, safety policies. It varies by state. So if you don't want to have to do those things and that wasn't your intention, then don't use the word school in your name.
Yes.
Don't tell the IRS that you're a school, and then have your families register or whatever it is in your state that they do to indicate that they are homeschoolers. Don't try to stay away from tracking their grades, tracking their report cards, sending report cards. Oh, the more that you own their education, the more that you do look like a school. So you want to be careful of those things. We track attendance for safety reasons, and it does feel important to. I just spoke with a founder this morning who was like, "Well, yeah, we had to deal with DHS because of a child protective issue," and she said, "Thankfully, they use a program called Spark, which is it's a school management system." And so they had attendance records just because they were using that feature in Spark. And so they needed it for DHS purposes, not because they're a school. So it's something to consider, but yeah, you want to be wary of being a school, telling the IRS that you're a school unless you actually intend to operate that way. And sometimes people do. There are some states, it's been a while, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I have a gal in Texas who is forming as a school, and she only meets 3 days a week. But there are some states where it's easier to form a private school than it is to form like a hybrid microschool type program because of the daycare laws.
Hmm.
So it like where if you're going to do a 2, 3, 4 day program and the state daycare exemption doesn't cover you and they want you to go through the entire daycare certification process, but then forming a school in that same state is super simple and straightforward, and complying with the school requirements is really easy, you might opt to be a school in that case.
Or it's gonna
So it
depend.
varies.
Yeah, it's gonna
It varies
depend on
depending on your
state.
state. Yes, every kid has a lot of resources for founders that are trying to navigate, like, should I be a school? Should I not be a school?
Right.
What are my daycare exemption rules? And it's worth looking into those things as well.
Absolutely.
I was going to say, kind of going back to that 1023 application, I have a video on my website. There's a page called 501c3 services. If you scroll down, there's a video on my website that helps you figure out what might your revenues be. Because if your fiscal year ends, a lot of times programs, the fiscal year will end like the end of June or even the end of May. So we're in March right now. So say that you formed an organization in March and then you're not going to start until August. Well, your first fiscal year would be March 9th through June 30th. And that's your first year. And you may not have any revenues during that time. So your first year had zero revenue. And then your second year would be July 1st through June 30th of the next year. Well, you'll probably have revenues that year and the second year. But because you had that really short first year, you might still qualify for the 1023 EZ form because it's a cumulative 150,000 over the first 3 years. So I have a video that dives deeper into that if
Perfect.
anybody's trying to navigate that part as
And
well. And
we're gonna be
sometimes,
putting those in the show notes as well, so that way they can access
perfect.
that.
Yeah. Sometimes people will ask, what if I choose the wrong form
Yes.
and I use the easy form and then we end up exceeding those income requirements. So there's not a fine. You don't lose your 501c3 status. You don't get fined, but the IRS may or may not, but they may later on down the road come back and be like, hey, you used the wrong form, so you need to use the long form now. And they don't give you any credit for the money that you paid. The short
For
form is
the short form.
$275 and the long form is 600. So they don't give you $275 credit. You just have to pay $600 and do the long form. And sometimes people are like, yep, we're just going to use the long form, because the thought of having to go back and do it all over again, especially if you're kind of on that borderline where you're not really sure, then it might just be safer just to do the long form. So,
It right. And so a little bit on that too, it does take a little bit longer
mhm.
to get long forms approved versus easy short
Yes.
forms, which take a lot less time. And that just has to do with
Hmm.
the wonderful IRS and how they deal with
Yeah.
paperwork coming
Yeah.
in. But also, like you had mentioned, there's no fines or anything like that. They also see like how quickly you've gotten funds. So let's say you do get a grant and you weren't expecting to get a grant, and now you have this jump, like $100,000 grant or something, and that puts you
Right.
over in that first 3 years. Um, and you weren't expecting it, like you said, it's possible, it's not probable, but it could
Hmm.
happen. The other thing is, okay, so let's say after that 3 years, you do end up making more. Do you need to go back and do the long form, or are you now out of that probationary period and it doesn't need to be redone because you've exceeded that after the 3 years?
Correct. You would not have to go back. So if in your fourth year you exceeded that limit, you wouldn't have to go back and do the long form. You're good. You're good to go. And they may even see if you get, like you said, that really, really large one-time grant, they may not even count that because it's not a regular part of your revenues. So they may disregard that as like an anomaly. Um, and there was something else I was going to say. But yeah, I'll think of it.
I think that's
Um,
one of the biggest things too, where people really feel like they need help, and that is something that you help with as well as the long form versus the short form, knowing which form to use and
yeah,
projecting, um, just, income and funding and all of that. It's not that the form is very challenging, but it can be a little bit tricky on wording and making sure you get the right, there's numerical system of how they put you in as a 501(c)(3) because not everybody has the
classification.
same, yeah, services.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yes. The 1020, I was just gonna say the 1023 easy is fairly navigable on your own. Carol Top, and maybe someday I'll make my own, but right now I just send people to Carol Top's website, the homeschoolcpa.com. She has a like a DIY package. And I think last time I checked, it was like $40 for a 3-part series. And the third part, second or third part, is how to do the 1023 easy form on your own. And there's, if I said one thing about that form, don't check the private foundation box. You are not a private foundation. You're an educational program. Because if you
it's
check the
public.
private foundation box, it is almost impossible to undo. And at that point, like you just close the whole thing and start over, which some people don't want to do. So don't check the private foundation box if you're
Yeah,
going to do the easy form by yourself. Use Carol Top's resources. She walks you through the steps in that process. I offer that as a service, but sometimes I'll tell people like, you can go use Carol Top's. And they're like, no, no, I want someone to walk me through this. Like, okay, well, that's what I do. But then the long form's a little bit of a beast, and it does have a financial reporting or projection section, a narrative section. So that is part of the services that I offer, where I fill it all out for you and then we submit it together.
and you're walking right along with them, so they also can see what, like, you're not just doing it for them and uploading it blind. Like, this is a partnership, collaborative
Yes.
process.
Yes. And yeah, initially, when I first started, it was kind of like, well, the goal is to keep costs low, because if it's a partnership and you're doing a fair amount of the work, like the incorporation and filling in the blanks in the bylaws and not just writing them for you, it does help keep the costs low, because my involvement is not as extensive as if I was writing everything myself. But then the more I was doing it, the more I was like, oh my gosh, this is by far the best way to go, because founders need to know what they're doing.
Absolutely.
Like they need to know, yeah, like you need to know what was put on those forms, what answers we put, what boxes we checked, and why it matters. And that's what I do. I spend a lot of my time explaining, like, we checked that box because, and that way founders go into running these nonprofits with so much more knowledge and understanding of like how it was set up and how it's supposed to operate.
Right. The confidence piece is really important, especially when you're starting something like an educational program, because I know that's usually a
Yeah.
thing. It's like, I can't do this. It's like, no, you can do this. You just need to know
Yeah.
why you're doing it and how to do it right. Okay, we are running out of time and I have
Yes.
so many more questions left. We might have to make a second
Okay.
episode for this. We talked about nonprofits still being able to turn a profit. Can you share about that? Because a lot of that is just the nonprofit can make money and it is a business. Can we talk about how nonprofits
Mhm.
are not just charities and we don't just do things for free? Because I think there's a lot of misconception about what a nonprofit actually does and how they run.
Right. Yeah. And this one feels maybe a little bit more black and white. So you hit the nail on the head. A nonprofit does not mean that you can't make a profit. Some people are like, oh my gosh, we're nearing the end of our fiscal year and we just need to like give away all the rest of our money that's still in the bank account because we don't want to show any money left at the end of our fiscal year. No, 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 that's not what being a nonprofit means. You can still have money in the bank. You can have a savings account, you can still have extra money at the end of your fiscal year. That so yes, being a nonprofit doesn't mean that you can't turn a profit. It just means that if there is extra money, if you had an LLC or an S corp or some other type, and you were running that as your own business, and at the end of the fiscal year there was $30,000 left, you could write yourself a check for $30,000 and take it home because you earned that profit in your business. So that's the difference. The nonprofit excess or the profit made generated doesn't go home with anybody. It's reinvested back into the programs, and it would be very good practice to have extra money in savings, to have a buffer. Like you need to, part of the duties of board members is to run a fiscally responsible organization. And part of being fiscally responsible is having a financial buffer so that you're not operating in the red or, like always on the edge. So yes, you can have extra money. Yes, people can get paid. So that's like you were saying, you're not providing services and things for free just because you are a charity, a public charity, or for public benefit. You can charge a reasonable cost for your goods and services that you're providing. So if you're providing an educational program, you can and should be charging families to operate that program, and perhaps charging, you should be charging a fair amount. You don't need to charge less because you're a nonprofit and
Right.
like, oh well, we can only charge a small amount because we're a nonprofit. You are still a business. You're still operating a business.
Right. And
And yes, you can still pay people.
there's still things we have to
I was
pay
just going
for.
to say the people that,
Right.
yeah, right. And one of those is staff. That's just what I was going to say. Like, you need to be able to pay your staff, and you need your staff to want to work there and like be able to make a living wage to work there. So if you're paying your staff, and then there's like all these fair labor laws that come into play, like you should be paying your staff at least minimum wage and things like that too. So if you're paying people, you want to pay them well, as well. So yes, you can pay people, all that good stuff.
That brings up a good point about labor laws and all of that. You absolutely want to follow all the labor laws. Do not try to like, oh, well, we're a nonprofit, so we're exempt from everything. No, you are not. You still need to have all the posters. You need to have
Mhm.
all the workman's comp. Like that's a whole nother thing. And I don't know if you take care of that or help nonprofits set that side of things up, but that is very important. If we're not operating as contractors and we're operating as employees, there's also a point at which you would
Yeah.
switch from contractors to employees and all of that.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I definitely have experience in that. I don't help people set those things up. I point people to Ministry Works is an organization. There's other organizations like Gusto and ADP. Ministry Works was the most affordable, although one of my clients recently was like, really? And she sent me their price sheet. And I was like, okay, so these are all extras. They had like all of these extra services included in their rate sheet that they were going to provide for her. So I was like, if we slash this and really just pare it down to payroll management, then it's still pretty affordable.
Right.
Um, so I point people to payroll management. It's if you're going to pay employees, just bite the bullet and have a payroll service manage that for you. They'll set it up for you in your state. They'll register you, with all the right agencies. And so I never had to learn the really, really, really nitty gritty, like how to set up an account for my organization in the state of Oregon and with the IRS, because the payroll service did that for me. So yeah, and like Contractors generally don't provide the key service of an organization. And if they're your teachers, then they're providing the key service of your organization. So I have a really hard time with like, yeah, they probably don't qualify as contractors, but
Yeah. We
um,
have several like that
but
that operate that way. We just
yeah,
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 as long as you know what you're doing and that there's a potential that
yes,
you need to switch them at some point, it might be easy to
yeah,
set it up that way so you're not responsible for taxes and all of that. We do have some other, and I can put their names in the show notes, but we do have another person that can help with all of that whole side with payroll and workman's comp and making sure you have all of your
yeah,
employee staff manuals done correctly. Then I'm blanking from the name right
perfect.
now, but yeah, I just want to make sure we cover that because so many people either cut themselves short and then they're resentful because they're not actually making the wage that they need to make. But there's also this whole societal like, oh, well,
Mhm.
education should be free, so we're, dealing with that as well. It's like, no, but this is still a service and I'm still providing just as much if not more than your daycare service down the road that you're happily paying $150 a week for. So, excuse me. I
Yeah,
digress. Um,
it's true. It's so true.
yes. Okay, so we talked about forming the nonprofit. Do you need an attorney, a CPA? I know you had mentioned about DIYing it. This is where you can come in. But do we need any of those other attorneys or CPAs to help get the nonprofit paperwork done, or that's something that you can just help them with on your own?
Right. So it's not a legal requirement. Some people are like, am I allowed to do this without like an attorney? So yes, you are allowed to do it without an attorney. I help people navigate it. The bylaw template that I use, because that is a legal document, was built off of Carol Top's bylaw template, and she's CPA. So I always love knowing like have that background of being able to draw on her experience. And um no, you don't have to have either one. If you have a
Okay.
really unique, there are occasions where someone will reach out to me and they'll have a really unique situation and it's perhaps way more complex than just starting this nice clean organization. And I might let them know, like, either I can still help you, but you're going to need to go, like, can you run all of this by an attorney? And you really need to use a nonprofit attorney and even like a CPA
Yes.
that's familiar with nonprofits because you can go talk to I have had to fix so many bylaws and articles of incorporation that were formed by law firms. So the what I explained about putting that required IRS wording in the articles of incorporation, there are law firms that don't know about that. And I've had to fix articles of incorporation with founders that don't have it. And they're like, but my attorney did this. Why didn't they do it right? I'm like, I don't know. They obviously they don't specialize in
And not
nonprofits because
right.
this is really basic knowledge. So make
Right.
sure you're talking to someone that like ideally they advertise that they specialize in
No.
nonprofits.
Yes.
But you
Yes.
can DIY it. Just make sure you're, use Carol's resources, reach out to me. You have someone walk alongside you, just to make sure that you're checking the right boxes.
Right. And you don't have to go back and dissolve and reinstate it like I did. Let's avoid
Right.
all of that,
Yes.
people. It's not worth
Yes.
it. Not worth it.
Exactly.
Um, okay, so moving right along, with that having to close and dissolve and all of these things, what happens when a nonprofit does want to close and can a founder sell it? Can an organization be sold?
Yeah, yeah. No. A nonprofit, like we said, doesn't belong to anyone. So that's part of what all of that IRS wording that we keep talking about. The last clause is the dissolution clause. So when a nonprofit is dissolved, a 501c is dissolved, that clause talks about that all of the assets, meaning all of the supplies and school supplies and PE supplies and equipment, and if you have furniture and tables and chairs and then if you have any money in the bank after that, you pay the debts. So after the debts are paid, and if you need to sell furniture and equipment to pay the debts, then you can do that. But once the debts are paid, then all of those things must be donated to another 501c3. So it doesn't belong to the board or to the participants in the program.
Right. Which can also be a deterrent for people who are like educators who are wanting to open up a nonprofit because then it's like, no, I can't just close this and move on with my life. All of the money that I've personally invested has to like be given away. And that can also
Yeah.
sometimes feel like severing. So and this is where we come back to the LLC versus nonprofit side. There is benefits, but there's also pros and cons. It's just the way it is. And if it's things that have been mostly donated, it's like, okay, great. I don't have a problem with that. If we're using like our own properties or things like that, that can't be given away because a lot of these educational services are at their own residency. Of course, does that just go, because you're not going to like donate your house back to another nonprofit. Do you know what I'm saying? Like
No.
it,
So, well, so your house, yeah, unless you do some like documented financial transaction, your house would never belong to the nonprofit. So the nonprofit may operate in your house, and the nonprofit can pay you a reasonable amount determined by the board, not you, because it's your house. The board can determine a reasonable amount to pay you to use the space
right,
and
like
for
a
like wear
rental.
and tear and all. Yeah, all of that should be documented. Who made that decision? How did they come to that understanding? Because you want to be able to show that it was a decision made at arm's length, and they can pay you for the use of that space. But at no point does your house become property of the nonprofit. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Um, all right. So we've talked about all the ins and outs. How hard is it to really keep up with all the nonprofit paperwork and the board and all of the voting and management of the bookkeeping and all of that? Because I feel like it's not a lot different from running an LLC or any other business, but can you share a little bit just about like specifics that are for a nonprofit?
Right. Yeah. You would definitely, bookkeeping and things like that should all be done with a high level of quality, just like you would if it was your business. Like any business, any nonprofit should have proper bookkeeping being done. So that's the same. The board meetings, it's helpful if the board meets at least 3 times a year, in my opinion. 4 might be better because then you're meeting
Once a
quarterly.
quarterly.
Um, yeah, so board meetings can take a couple hours, 2 or 3 hours, and depending on your role on the board, president, secretary, treasurer, you may have outside responsibilities. Some board members are just board members and they just come to the meeting and they have a vote and they have a say. They don't have a lot of outside responsibilities unless they have a different role in the organization and maybe they're a volunteer in another aspect. So, but like if you're the board president, then you're the one creating the agenda for the board meeting. And the board president is usually the one that connects with, if they are not already, the one running the program director, the one running the organization. So if you're overseeing a program director, the program director usually works most closely with the board president. But the board president runs the board meeting, schedules the board meeting, creates the agenda. The secretary tracks, like you need to track the major events, decisions, keynotes of your board meetings. So the secretary does that and then types them up at the end, sends them out for approval. The treasurer is the one that, if they're not the bookkeeper, they're the one that's holding the bookkeeper accountable and reviewing the financial reports, making sure there are financial reports brought to the board meetings. So those are some regular things. But again, like a lot of that should be happening whether it's a nonprofit or not. The accountability and the documentation, those things should be happening still. Um, so I don't know that it's a ton more work. There's more checks and balances. So if you're the board president and you're the program director, which is somewhat common, um, you might be like me and be like, oh my gosh, this is such a great opportunity. We're totally gonna do that. And then you go to the board meeting and you go, oh my, yeah, so hey, we just committed to this thing and I'm gonna start this and it's gonna be great. And the board's like, dude, that's a massive decision. You can't just do that. So it was really good for
There.
me. It took me a long time, right? It took me a long time to be like, okay, we're a team. Like we work as a team, and the board was wonderful. Like I appointed most of them at some point because I was the founder. So like they were on my team and they were passionate about my vision. They respected my visionary, like crazy ideas, and rarely if ever said no. But it was really like they are investing and giving their time to show up to board meetings and to put their name on legal documents for the organization. So the least I can do is include them in what's going on and like let them weigh the pros and cons and let them have a say. And most of the time the request was just that I slow down and consider, consider the consequences, consider the risks and the benefits, and be
Yes.
able to share with them how I plan to address those things. And then
Mhm.
they were always like, this is great, go for it, like, we support you, how can we help? So the board is not a bad thing. But if you're just 100 miles ahead all by yourself, that can go poorly.
Yes.
So the board meetings maybe can slow you down a little bit, but in the long run, like, it's probably a really good thing for people like me. A lot of founders are similar personalities to myself. It's really good for us to slow down, consider the risks and benefits, include other people, and not just charge 100 miles ahead by ourselves all the time. So,
Yes. Yeah. You,
you know,
you'll thank
yeah.
yourself later when you're not burnt out.
Right. And when
Yes.
you're, or like you said at the beginning, I left, and my kids will probably be back. They've been in a little private Christian school full time for a couple years. They'll probably be back at the at least at the co-op this fall. So I haven't been, I'm very supportive and, like, emotional support, but I haven't been involved in the organization in almost 3 years, and it's still going and running at the same level as when I left it. So in the end, I feel like that's probably the bigger goal. Entrepreneurs can be very, we're startup people. So thinking that you're going to stay with something for the next 30 or 40 years probably isn't in line with who your personality anyways. And if you can start it as a nonprofit, get it established, get some people behind it that really the retriever faithful personality, where they can stick with it long term. And then if you have a big idea 10 years later and you want to move on and do something else, it can still run and your time wasn't wasted.
Right. Because
Because
it's
the goal is not that it dissolves, but that it keeps going and it outlives you.
right, right. You want it to impact the community, which is why the whole point of running the nonprofit in the first place is for the community benefit. Most of us are moms and educators, and we're wanting the future benefit for our children's children to be able to have these
Yeah.
resources. So it's in our best interest to appoint people, like you said, who are going to be the people that stay faithful and, chug along and the day-to-day
Mhm.
operations, which typically isn't the founders who have all the big startup visionary big plans.
Right.
But
Uh-huh.
it just really depends on how the founders want to run it. I do have one more question
Hmm.
for you because I know several are um presidents and executive directors, which is kind of conflicting. You eventually want to appoint a
Hmm.
president and be the executive director, which is a paid position, versus the president, which is a board position. Can you talk a little bit about that interest, Chrissy, and then we'll close it out.
Yeah. I mean, like you stated, that would be the goal. And that was how I started. I started as the founder. I was the program director and I was the board president. And this was like 11 years ago. And I've learned a lot since then, a lot of it from firsthand experience. And at that point, I don't even think I knew, like, how much of a conflict of interest that could be. It just didn't sit right with me because I had recruited people to be on the board, and like I said, it was kind of like a one woman show, but they were showing up and I needed them to contribute to the board, to come to the board meetings, because I wanted it to be a 501(c)(3). We wanted to be eligible for grant funding and use volunteers. So I needed to have a board. And the board, there was a little bit of it feeling like it was a dictatorship. Um, because they were willing to contribute and there were very capable people, women on the board, who could have been in those leadership positions as well. And so by year two, it was the end of year two where I let the board know that I was going to be stepping down from the director, not the director, the president role, and that I was not going to be the president in the new fiscal year, and that I would still like to be on the board, and not necessarily, I don't want to be treasurer or secretary, I just want to be on the board. And so then I was the program director and a board member, but one of the other, the board had a discussion and, like, we voted as a whole to vote one of the other ladies to be the president, and that helped bring balance, and helped the board feel a little bit more like it wasn't a dictatorship. And I always laugh because there's people listening who are like, but I want it to be a dictatorship. Well, run it as an LLC. You may not qualify for some things, but maybe in the end, maybe that's going to be the better fit for you. But by and large, the 501(c)(3) is the best fit if you can wrap your head around like, okay, it's going to need to be a team effort. And
Getting the right team on.
founders,
Yeah.
yes. And like I always try to help people see as the founder, you're the one pouring your heart and your soul into this thing, and it is your baby, and people can see that. And it's very, very rare for someone to be like, psh, and just like poo poo on what you're doing, mostly because they have, at the end of the day, they have their kids in the program that you're driving. And if they get rid of you or they, shut you down, then you may not be able to give what you are giving at the moment that their families are benefiting from. So most of the time it's the other way around, where they want to empower you and free you up and support you to be who you are, because you created this amazing things that their kids love to be a part of, and that is a blessing to their family. And so it's usually the other way. It's very rare for it to not be a positive situation.
Right, right. It can happen. Like
Yeah.
I said, we've had several, but
Yeah.
that's not the norm. And that
Right.
really goes
It's
back
important
to,
to choose good board members
yes, I was gonna say, it
who
really
you
goes back to
choose.
like vetting who you choose and making sure that a lot of it's gonna be parents and things, and parents can have
Hmm.
could say sometimes you can have, people from the Chamber of Commerce or the Small Business Association like in
Hmm.
your town. It doesn't have to be people that are coming to your school. So, is there any last
Right.
words of
Yeah.
wisdom that you have for founders uh, about just running a program in general?
Oh gosh. I'm in a season of take care of yourself.
Yes.
So I didn't for 10 years, because like I have had so many children, and my kids, like I still have a whole bunch of them at home. And but then like I was having babies and toting around toddlers while I was starting and running programs and shoveling gravel and like painting large buildings and taking walls out. And I just, strap the baby on and put a little mask on their face while you're pulling out drywall. It was a lot. And so founders I know are going through, a lot of them are going through similar experiences. And it's so important to take care of yourself. Like
Yeah.
I spent most of the last year like at the doctor's office and getting blood work done and kidney stones zapped and all kinds of things, because I was so, and I'm super ADD, so I can be really, really hyper
Oh,
focused. And I
mm-hmm.
was super hyper focused for like 10 years, that my body has paid the price. And I'm like so thankful that this year I'm feeling better. But I don't know that it had to be that way. I probably could have
Yes.
prioritized my mental health and my physical health better and sooner. I like hyper focusing. It's fun. That's how my brain works, but it
Yes.
was probably not the right choice. So I would
I'm so glad.
encourage founders like, yes, please don't deprioritize yourself, your physical health and your mental health, your family, your spiritual health. Like all of those things are still really, really important. And you can find a way to do both, even though I don't know that I would have believed that. You can find a
Yes.
way to do both.
And that
Yeah.
is really where you wanna get the coach, get the mentor to help you. That's a lot of what I do with my founders, is not just helping them with business strategy, but like, okay, how can we make this business strategy work so that you're also thriving personally, individually, as
Right.
well as your business. So, so important.
Mhm.
All right. If they want to
Yes.
connect with you, we are going to be putting some of the links and things in the show notes. Where is the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, my website is nonprofitedsolutions.com. So I've got information there, resources, there's some free downloads and things like that, program handouts and all kinds of stuff that people can use for resources. I've got a growing blog. And then my email is just Becky, Becky, at nonprofitedsolutions.com.
Perfect. It was such a pleasure having you on. We will absolutely have another conversation because I'm sure we could talk and talk and talk about this topic. It is very near and dear to my heart. And it's just been, I think, a wealth of information for all those listening. So thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Happy homeschooling, everyone.